I see we have everything ready for Yochana and Thomas to start. So let me introduce Yochana and Thomas. Yochana is an identity program manager at Microsoft, and Thomas is a senior program manager at Microsoft. And today they're going to be talking about monitoring and incident response in Azure AD, which is a very interesting topic, given the importance of the identity features in Azure AD and the protections that have been in place. But will not steal their thunder, and I'll give them the floor. So over to you, Yochana and Thomas.
Thank you. I think Yochana, you're still on mute.
Yes. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone.
Hello. Oh, let me see. So slides are working. That's good. Slide control. It's a bit delayed. Yeah. Good morning from my side as well. My name is Thomas Detzner. I'm in the same team as Yochana, and it was actually a great segue from the previous talk into our talk. So thanks for the nice questions on that, Maxime. And it's a great leadway into our discussion. So shall we get started?
Let's go. Okay, shall we just a quick introduction to myself. So yeah, my name's Yochana. As Maxim said, I'm program manager in the Identity Networks Access product group here at Microsoft, and we're part of a V team that was looking at kind of Azure AD Sec Ops and incident response, and kind of trying to help blue teams better monitor and respond to threats in their Azure AD environments, which is how this is all come about.
Yeah, and like I said, my name is Thomas Detzner. I'm in the very same team as Yochana. Also worked at the same V team as Yochana to create the guidance that we wanted to share with you guys today. And yeah, also looking forward to your feedback. Before we get started, we wanted to start off with a little story. A couple of weeks back, there was one of those days, one of those Fridays actually, was late, well past 10 p.m. at night. I got an email from a customer saying that they have a repo for a very interesting behavior that they're seeing in their tenant. And they saw some very strange sign-in events for a Microsoft App ID, which was coming from another tenant, which was not under their control. When looking into this, they didn't know about the app and what was it supposed to do, and only saw that it's highly permissioned. Fast forward to Monday morning, I found myself in daily ad hoc calls with the customer's senior leadership team, the CERT team, and the cloud identity team. So just to set a stage, what we're going to talk about today. Moving over to Yochana.
Yeah, so the approach that we've taken today is to kind of take you through some of the most common attacks that we do see against Azure AD environments, and kind of give you some tips on what to monitor, and then share some kind of incident playbooks and stuff that we've got. So the one things that we're going to be going through are password sprays, privileged accounts and actions taken by them, and then Thomas will take you through the malicious app consent, some of the infrastructure pieces, so the hybrid components that pretty much most all organizations have, and then a summary of go-dos and some bonus PowerShell content at the end. Okay, so first of all, we're just going to kind of quickly go through so we're all on the same page about what we are talking about. So Azure AD is made up of multiple components. So Azure AD is not AD in the cloud, as you can see here. There's many more components to it. So we split these into what we call cloud services, which are the Azure AD components, and then the hybrid components as well that you can see, which are normally your on-prem components that you also need to monitor. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk to you about, I'm sure you know about, is password spray. So unfortunately, password spray attacks are still increasing. And unfortunately, they are still successful. So they remain one of the cheapest attacks for attackers to hit against an enterprise. And as long as they still work, they will still be used. There was an uptake in password sprays during COVID as more remote working happened. And so the general way of how these work, so it's one common password that is used against many different accounts within your Azure AD tenant. Typically, we are seeing that attackers are trying to remain very low and slow, so they're under thresholds that are set. And then after a successful login, the GAL can be dumped and then used to start pivoting within your environment to get whatever data, specific data that is needed. Okay, so one of the things that we have suggested in our new kind of SecOps guides are defining normal. So defining expected behavior does help you determine unexpected behavior within your tenant. So this can be, how many bad password attempts are normally had, how many, smart lockouts do you normally have, and so you can start setting thresholds to alert on these. But one thing to note, so it is not a silver bullet. As I've mentioned, attackers do use reconnaissance to find threshold settings to try and remain undetected within your environment. So yeah, just a quick kind of takeaway from the first couple of slides is, have you defined what normal is for you in your organization? As I say, it doesn't have to be necessarily a threshold. It can be, working times, it can be working hours, it can be, what's normal for users or user groups within your tenant. So going on to some areas that you should most definitely be monitoring for, which is obviously failed authentication requests. This is both to Azure AD and ADFS. This is normally, if we're talking about password spray, is against multiple accounts, and they tend to come from the same external IP address. Just be aware, if you block that IP address, another one 9 times out of 10 will pop up and start the same behavior and same activity. So just because you've blocked that specific avenue doesn't mean another one's not going to pop up in the same attack as well. So something that's important as well is interrupted authentications. So in saying this, I am hoping that organizations have MFA turned on. I know still there are quite a few organizations that do not. So main takeaway from this would be, please turn on MFA. But interrupted authentications can mean that the password has been compromised, but the attacker is actually failing the MFA challenge. This can be because the user is ignoring it. It could be denied by the user, but the attacker still has the password. So there's been a compromise of a password, but not necessarily of the account. Okay. So yeah, reviewing your smart lockout counters. So this is something to continuously review. If you have smart lockout, if an IP address goes into the banned list, again, it's good to take that IP address and start looking at what activity has happened from that or who's specifically been targeted. And you can get that from your ADFS logs. Also, an increase in failed authentication using legacy authentication. So legacy authentication is still the #1 protocol used in password sprays. If you see an increase in this against your tenant as a whole or against a specific account, it's something that does need to be alerted on. In Azure Monitor, there are kind of workbooks that are already there for you to use that you can then pull that data into your SIEM tool of choice, just so you can start monitoring for that protocol in your environment. Okay, so monitoring for successful unusual sign-ins. So not all successful sign-ins are good. We don't want to think they are. So successful authentication, for example, from a known attacker IP address would be classed as successful sign-in, but quite obviously not a good one. So other areas to look is authentication is happening outside the user's country of normal use. So with this, on its own is a detection. This might not initially say compromise or something malicious. It could be, your users are on holiday, they're entitled to go on holidays. But when you start adding lots of different things up, then it can start to look malicious or something to investigate. And so one of the things that we use is identity protection. So if you have unfamiliar sign-in properties and a location change, and then possibly maybe on a different device than normal, those 3 things then start to build a bigger picture of what could be malicious. And also one of the detections that we do have is password spray in identity protection. And just so it is noted, in identity protection, we don't have many hard-coded risks to events, because it's all based on a number of different things. Password spray is one of only 2 that is hard-coded to high risk, and that is because we have a very good successful detection rate for that, and so it is immediately a high risk. And if a password spray alert happens, it means the account has been successfully suffered a password spray. Okay, so this is an example. Go on, Thomas. So yeah, so on the password spray, as we said before, the password could be compromised, but not necessarily the MFA. Something we are learning quite quickly about MFA prompts is that more prompts do not equal better security. So MFA fatigue is becoming a real problem in organizations, and it is leading end users to click the accept button when it is not them. And this is enabling, obviously, attackers to gain access to accounts, and all of those, add up to, is it a good sign in or is it not? And when the user's selected MFA, it can make it a little bit more difficult. So just think about your MFA policy quite carefully. Okay, and this is an example of one of the risk detections. So this is the password spray one. So as you can see here, we've got the risk level of high. As I say, that is hard-coded just for this specific risk event type, which you can see here is password spray. And then the risk state is at risk, which means the user has been identified as being at risk. So you can pull these into your SIEM tool, as you say, SIEM tool of choice. But what can it also do is it can help automate a lot of your incident response, which can give you more time to investigate, and it can also limit the time that an attacker has if an automated response is put in place over a manual one. Okay, so privileged accounts in actions we're going to go into. So privileged accounts are normally defined as an administrator, but just so you're aware, it can be a user that's got access to sensitive data. So it could be commercial data or financial data that you want to class as kind of, one of your high assets. And so we recommend to monitor all activity on all privileged accounts. This is still one of the main, these are the main accounts attackers go after to try and, gain access to data, gain persistence in an Azure AD tenant, but also to cause disruption if that is their end game. Okay, so just a few of the things is sign-ins, successfuls, additions of MFA methods, in password changes. So all of those things need to be logged. In order, all changes, these are both successful and failed. You need to know the failed ones as well. It can give an indication of kind of what the attacker wants to gain out of their privilege if they gain privileged accounts. Also, exclusions to conditional access policies. We can, trying to get around security controls you've put in place. Thomas will go through how you can kind of monitor that. In tenant level changes, especially if these change your security posture of your tenant. So we'll go into those a bit more about which ones are quite, could change that posture quite significantly. And to monitor for accounts with no MFA or MFA registered outside normal country of use. So as we say, privileged accounts, please, 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 if anything, just go and turn on MFA for those privileged accounts at least. We are seeing attackers, if they do gain access to an account, they are adding additional MFA methods to those accounts, and that is to gain that persistence of access for that account. Okay. So monitoring some privileged access paths. So accounts added to privileged roles or roles assigned outside of your PIM solution. So we do understand there may be a business requirement to not use a PIM solution, but if that is the case, that needs to be documented, monitored, and reassessed. Each month, each 2 months. Elevation not occurring on a poor or SOAR device if you have poor or SOAR devices within your tenant. And something that does sometimes get missed is governance. So review access as part of your lifecycle management. It's easy to take away permissions and give them back than have an unused account sat there potentially it's increasing your attack surface, which you don't want. And this is just going into one of, to the big tenant level changes. So it should be acted on immediately if it is not planned. So additions of a new trusted tenant or a connected organization to Azure AD tenant, and also monitoring for change in something called access management for Azure resources. So this is a setting in Azure AD, and it allows global admins permissions to every Azure subscription in management groups in your tenant. If this is set to no and it changes to yes, this, again, something you really need to be alerting on as soon as possible, because your attack surface has then widened significantly for your tenant. Okay, quick one on break glass accounts. So these are important if you ever get locked out of your tenant. I hope you never do. But yeah, create at least 2 emergency access accounts for Azure AD. These do tend to be highly privileged and excluded from things like CA, PIM, and MFA policies, because the whole point is if any service goes down, you can gain access back into your tenant. So securing your emergency access credentials, this is actually done different ways in different organizations. So some organizations use things like a FIDO key for their break glass accounts. Others have, one person will know 50% of the password, another person will know another 50%. Either way, you're going to do that, make sure it's all safe and there's a soft policy written around that break glass account. So monitoring for this break glass account is monitoring all usage. So as you can see here, we've set the threshold value to 0, and this is so it will alert on any activity whatsoever. This should never be used. If it is being used, you'll most likely be in quite a major incident. And also make sure you validate periodically the accounts. And one last bit of advice is, we see this so much, do not name your break glass account break glass or emergency. Attackers would, they do look for those naming conventions. So yeah, don't name them obvious names. Okay, just a couple of other IOCs to consider, and this is just what we're seeing across enterprise tenants. So something to look out for and know that this is kind of what attackers are trying to do. And so it's important to have your privileged accounts created from approved sources. So if it's created outside of that process, there needs to be action as to why. It could be someone didn't know the process, but either way, it's something to just keep an eye on and alert on going forward. Also, naming conventions not in line with current policy. So if an attacker has done reconnaissance, they might be able to get your naming convention, but we have seen it where they've not quite got it right and it's stuck out a little bit. So yeah, accounts created for a short period of time. With this, it's also good to look at what action was done when the account was there for that short period of time. So if an account was created and they then created a service principal with high permissions, then the account was deleted or not used, they've changed where they're using their persistence. So they don't need the privileged account anymore, and their persistence and their data exfil is being gained from the service principal that has high privileges in your tenant. So access, yeah, outside of normal working hours. We do see attacks happening outside of normal working hours. Attackers do hope that you're on reduced hours, your SOC teams might be hard to get hold of. So the thought process is it's probably going to take longer to react to an attack outside of working hours. Also, a deviation from users' normal role activity. So this doesn't have to be privileged. It could be, as we said, like a user that's got access to commercials or finance, for example. If there is a user that does not normally access finance and then they all of a sudden start trying to, and you see quite a lot of failed access requests, it's something that needs to be raised. Is it insider or is it malicious attacker? And MFA fraud alerts as well. So this is a great way for end users to be able to alert you that they have not requested an MFA prompt, and they can send a fraud alert to admins. Please note this does block the user from being able to use their account though. Okay, again, this is just an example of, so as I said, this is the user access kind of toggle in Azure AD, and this can be found in Azure Monitor under directory activity. And so the event category is administrator, and as you can see, the message is from the elevate access action. So this is what you need to be alerting on for that change. As I say, it significantly increases your attack surface to your tenant. I'm going to now pass over to Thomas, who's going to take you through the rest of the presentation. So over to you, Thomas.
Great, thank you, Yochana. So next one, malicious app consent. As we hinted at the beginning with the little story, this is a threat that we start seeing more and more being used. Yeah, the last 18 months have been definitely unprecedented, as everyone of us is very much aware. We've seen very well-crafted phishing emails. Here are a few examples as screenshots, and what's being done there is the attacker trying to spoof the users into consenting a malicious app, and then the service principal is being created in tenant, and then the mailbox of that user or multiple users are being taken over, and all the emails being downloaded, encrypt the content, and then a ransom is being requested from the users to regain access to their data. The challenge here is that even though if you clean up that service principal, the attacker may still have persistence in your tenant because they may have still created, or they may have created other service principals. Even if you created the initial service principal or app, then the persistence may still be there for the attacker, and you may not obviously see that right away. So how do you find that? The first, or we essentially have two main ways. The first way is using PowerShell. To make the whole process easier, we have created a script for you guys to use. You can find that at AKMS, get Azure AD permissions. And what it does, it gets an inventory of all the applications and the granted permissions within a given tenant. And we believe it's the fastest and most rough method. So you can use it for any size of a tenant, so small tenants, very large tenants. So we've seen that used with tenants with more than 5,000 apps in it. So it also scales very well. The other option is to use Microsoft Cloud App Security or tools like Microsoft Cloud App Security. The benefit for those tools is that they come with some out of the box anomaly detection automation policies. For example, so in two ones for the app name, so OAuth app and the publisher app, they look into string manipulation or string funkiness, so to say, on the apps or in the publisher names. So to spoof that this is maybe a legit app or a legit publisher, even though it's not. For the specific scenario here, you will want to have a look at the malicious OAuth app consent detection. This detection leverages the Microsoft Security Graph. It gets signals from various different sources, and we check like if the app is requesting too high of permissions, and then flag them as such. The last one I wanted to call out here is the OAuth app file download activity detection that triggers on anomalies that we see. So if the user starts, let's say, for example, like mass downloads of files that signal fires, or if the user downloads files that it typically doesn't touch, also alerts getting fired. So very valuable here. So what else? Let's dive a little bit deeper. So let's say you start using the tool and download the permissions or create the CSV file from the PowerShell tool. What will get you is the CSV file with two main tabs. So you will want to start with the high risk apps tab and filter on the user assigned count to all users. So you will want to look at apps that are assigned to all of the users and are automatically flagged as a high risk. Also, have a look to all non-Microsoft applications, because they are not what we call first-party apps. And we have a very rough process of making sure that the permissions and settings are legit and needed only for the for the purpose that the app really needed. The next thing then is to go to the high-risk user tab and start looking at the actual privileges that are assigned to those apps. And also look at, is it for which department the app is used, and does it request any sensitive permissions, for example. The next question then is obviously like, oh, so what kind of privilege do I look for? So good news is we have an answer for you. Here's a list of those permissions that you will want to have a look at. Pay special attention to all the read-write.all permissions, or directory, obviously read-write.all. These are very powerful permissions. Any app with these permissions should be carefully reviewed and properly understood if they're legit, and if they really need that permission. And to help with the full process, we created a incident response playbook, and there was a question already in the chat here. So if you haven't had a chance or haven't seen the playbooks, go have a look there. Specifically for the app consent, we created like step-by-step instruction how you do the investigation, and also specifically with the mindset that you do not need the premium features available. If you do, it's great. It will help a lot with the automation and speed up the whole process. But there's no, the playbooks don't rely on those functionalities. Yeah, what else to look for? Have a look for strange sounding names in the app. So like, for example, like email we have seen, or like misspelled names, Microsoft, with a spelling mistake, to spoof the users and to get easily overlooked. Also look, as Yochana indicated, strange activities out of office hours or from different, like from locations that are unusual. That's something you will want to have a look at. And generally any deviation from the user's normal behavior that they're daily using. The other one that we've seen quite often is, when you get your first indicators, like typically with the phishing email, you typically get the get a timestamp, and then use that to look for any service principal creation around this time from the first indicators. See if there are any apps or service principal being created in the tenant, and if so, have a close look what those are and if there are legit app use cases. Moving over to the infrastructure piece. So that's the last piece of the guidance that we've created. As a recap, as Yochana mentioned at the beginning, it's key to understand what is Azure AD, really, how is it being made up? So it's not Active Directory in the cloud. It's so much more. It's so much more microservices that are running. And depending on your setup, it may contain several on-premises components as well that you should be having under close or proper auditing and monitoring. Let's have a look. Essentially all of the on-premises authentication components need to be treated as control plane roles. So in the previous roles, I heard there was a talk about the credential tiering model. So what we called previously tier 0, we now call this the control plane. But all these hybrid components need to be treated exactly as that. So for the cloud, for a hybrid cloud setup, so these are your federation servers, so ADFS or any other federation servers, your AD Connect servers, your PTA agents, app proxy connectors, and other agents that you may have set up for your tenant. Also, we want you to make sure you leverage Defender for Identity for your domain controllers and ADFS servers. Earlier this year, we added support for ADFS server detections. So definitely highly recommend to leverage these automation capabilities there. And lastly, we wanted to make sure that you ensure that no synchronized identity holds any privilege other than a regular user in your Microsoft 365 tenant environment. The main reason here is that we wanted to make an isolation of your M365 administrative accounts from your on-prem to your tenant, and I want to make sure that these administrative accounts in the clouds have no privileges on-prem and vice versa. And the same is true for the devices that are managed in M365. In addition to that, and it was also mentioned prior, make sure that all your admin accounts use MFA with no exception, and that the MFA usage is enforced, ideally via conditional access policies. Diving a little deeper, what about hardening and monitoring there? So for the domain controls and federation servers, yeah, there is no big change there really. It's, make sure that all of those authentication components are hardened per the most recent operating system baseline that those servers are running on. Patch them quickly and often. They are tier 0/control plane service, so that means they're one of the most critical systems in your on-prem infrastructure. And as such, you want them to be as up to date as possible. And additionally, you want to, all the pass the ticket and pass the hash type of monitoring that are in place, and leverage ideally automation tools. For example, Defender for Identity would be from our side the tool of choice here for those kind of attacks. For the AD Connect servers, treat them both the primary and the staging server as a control plane world. Don't forget the staging server. So we've seen it sometimes that, yes, the primary is properly hardened and properly monitored, but the staging server may get lost, and also keep all the agents up to date there. We have had a few updates last month. So if you haven't updated your Azure AD Connect server, maybe now it's a good time to update them next week. For ADFS, we want, and federation service in general, maybe speaking, we want you to look at the sign-in event logs for failed and successful events. And also, make sure that these events track the source IP address. As Yochana indicated, password spray is still a very prominent attack, and make sure it's being streamed or forwarded to your SIEM tool that you're using. Also monitor the smart logout events, as we heard, to make sure you see like if ADFS is doing smart logouts. And as mentioned before as well, Defender for Identity was specifically updated for ADFS to alert on specific attacks that we've seen against ADFS servers. So highly recommended to install the ADFS monitoring from Defender for Identity so that you get early indicators on the ADFS servers. Moving over to the cloud components. So what do we recommend for your cloud components? Key things here is, let's start with conditional access. Conditional access for us is, one of the key components also for a zero trust strategy. So any changes to your key conditional access policy, for example, like you have, you should have conditional access policies for all your admin roles to enforce MFA. Any changes there need to be reported immediately and acted on. We have created workbooks for the conditional access insights. If you're not aware, here's a link in the presentation to have a look. Those workbooks can help you identifying gaps in the policies or coverage of the CA policies. Have a look and monitor on any additional connected domains that's being getting added to your tenant, and any changes to global settings such as MFA policy, your B2B policy, your external policy, which also Yochana touched on before already, as well as subscription level changes for global admins. So these are very powerful permissions that can get an attacker vast access to subscriptions and data and maybe compute power in the cloud. Also, as we've seen from the app consent scenario, for a malicious app consent scenario, look at changes to the consent policies in your tenant, as well as any apps that have been consented with too high of permissions. Again, call out to the IR playbooks that we've mentioned earlier. Yeah, lastly, we wanted to get you away with some very concrete, go-dos, what we want you to do next week, ideally. The first thing, have a look at the full guide that we talked about today. have a look at the Azure AD Sec Ops guides. You can find it at AKMS Azure AD Sec Ops, and make sure you monitor all of those key elements that are called out. The next thing, if you haven't seen those already, have a look at the IR playbooks, AKMS IR playbooks. We have created guidance for 3 main scenarios: phishing, app consent, and password spray, as well as a general guidance on an incident response process. How we see, things have changed when it comes to cloud IR. They are also reflected in the general guidance changes. And we also created a complete new PowerShell module. If you haven't seen it, again, please download today. Here's a link to the PowerShell gallery, Azure AD Incident Response, which will also help automating the investigation in the cloud. And hopefully you don't have that anytime soon, but if you find an attack being confirmed, start your IR process ASAP. So to make it a bit more concrete, we wanted to give you a little bit more details about that new PowerShell module. So we've spent a bit of time on automating those the necessary step, and we've worked here very closely with our own incident response team. So the PowerShell module was created hand in hand with the Dart team and our own CSS security team, and we also use that in our investigations. So the first thing you want to do is you want to connect to your tenant, and that module or that commandlet will make it easier to connect. So it wraps several commands, and it will automatically get access tokens for Graph API and Azure AD Graph, as well as for Azure AD PowerShell and MS Online PowerShell services. The next thing then, and here is a concrete example for the malicious app consent scenario, we want to search for specific apps that are being accessed. And here we use the get Azure AD IR sign-in detail. And as you can see here, you can filter on the multiple apps that are being accessed, and then you can export that to a CSV file, which you can then later use to filter for, or do some additional data manipulation on your local investigation machine. But wait, there's more, one more. So here's a screenshot on how that module looks like right now. When you load it, all the commandlets that are being available. And one of the very nice things that we're very happy about is, and it's basically also a learning from the investigation that we've seen, the vast majority is still, a hybrid environment, like more or less large setup on-prem. Here we have a commandlet which also, does the correlation between privileged users in the cloud to on-prem. And what it does, it crawls the directory roles and finds the members, and then checks if they also have privileges on-prem. So have a look there. Happy to hear your feedback. Any things that you think we should change or add, please do let us know. And with that, here are our contact details. Happy to hear your thoughts and feedback, as I said. And don't hesitate to reach out to us. We're happy to hear that. With that, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the SANS Blue Team Summit.
All right. Thank you very much, Yochana and Thomas, for this really good talk. I mean, the entire Azure environment is, of course, there's a lot of components there, and I'm glad that you highlighted a couple of them. I think one of those things that we often encounter, and you as well, is indeed what you mentioned with a lot of people that are not used to the Azure environment, thinking that the AD is just a copy in Azure. It's completely different indeed, a lot of components, and I think you highlighted that quite nicely. Just one question, that I want to draw your attention to, because it was asked in Zoom and not in Slack, so you might not have seen it, is a question here from John. Is there a way to make Azure MFA use an included number in both the prompt and the phone pop-up as the completely passwordless login does?
Not exactly sure I understand the question. Can you repeat that? Or
Yes, of course. So
read it.
let me copy paste this into the into Slack as well, so you can read it. If it's not something you can answer now, it's fine. You can answer it later. But it's basically a number, include a number in the prompt and the phone pop-up as the completely passwordless login does.
I see. Okay. Not right now. So there's something we look into that to give the end user more visibility on, what they're actually, accepting the MFA prompt to. The main vehicle, though, we're looking into will be, the Authenticator app. But yeah, have a watch out to the announcement that are hopefully coming in the next couple of months to get more visibility on, what the user is actually being asked for. So yes, we are aware and we're working on it. And as Yochana said, so MFA fatigue is a real problem, and we're very much aware of that, and yeah, we're working on improving that story there.
All right. Thank you very much for that answer. All right.
Sure.
Well, thanks again for this amazing presentation, and enjoy the rest of the day. And I'm sure there will be follow-ups on your Slack channel as well. So it'd be nice to have some interaction there. Thanks again.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.